There is a specific fantasy that lives rent-free in the heads of millions of Americans. You wake up early, but not because you have to. You walk into your own space, the smell of fresh espresso hitting you before the door even closes behind you. The light comes through the windows just right. Your regulars come in. You know their orders, they know your name. By 10 in the morning, you have already made more human connections than most office workers make in a week. This is the cafe dream, and it is one of the most powerful entrepreneurial fantasies in American culture. It is also one of the most expensive ones to wake up from. Because here is what the dream never includes. It never includes the number you are going to hear in about 30 seconds. And that number is the reason most cafes never open at all, and the reason many of the ones that do open are gone within 5 years. So, you want to own a cafe. Let's talk about what that actually costs.
Before the espresso machine, before the exposed brick, before you have designed a single cup sleeve or chosen a font for your logo, you need to deal with the first number that stops most people cold. Opening a standard independent cafe in the United States in 2026 costs somewhere between $80,000 and $300,000. That range is not vague. It reflects a genuine fork in the road every aspiring cafe owner hits before they sign a single document. At the cheaper end, you are taking over an existing cafe space. Someone else already paid to install the commercial plumbing, the grease trap, the ventilation. Maybe they left equipment behind. You are inheriting infrastructure. At the expensive end, you are starting with a raw retail shell, blank walls, no plumbing, no ventilation, nothing. And commercial construction in the United States currently runs between $80 and $150 per square foot. A 1,200 square foot cafe in that scenario costs between $96,000 and $180,000 just to build out, before you have bought a single coffee bean or hired a single barista. Your equipment is the second largest cost after the build-out. And this is where the dream version of your cafe collides with commercial reality at full speed. The espresso machine that sits at the center of everything, the one you have been imagining, costs between $5,000 for an entry-level commercial unit and $22,000 for a premium two-group machine from a brand like La Marzocco or Sinesso. You need at least 2 grinders, one dedicated to espresso, one for filter or drip, often a third for decaf. You need refrigeration, a batch brewer, a blender for cold drinks, a point of sale system, smallwares, and furniture. Total equipment budget for a standard specialty cafe between $30,000 and $60,000. Then there is the lease. Most landlords require first month, last month, and a security deposit of 1 to 3 months' rent before you get the keys to anything. In a major American city, a 1,000 square foot cafe space runs between $3,000 and $6,000 per month. In a secondary city, Denver, Nashville, Austin, it drops to roughly $2,000 to $3,750 per month. That deposit obligation alone, before you have renovated a single wall or bought a single piece of equipment, can run between $10,000 and $36,000. Add licenses, permits, health department inspections, initial inventory, professional fees, and the contingency fund you absolutely need, because something unexpected will break in the first 6 months, guaranteed. And a realistic total startup number for a mid-size independent cafe in an average American city sits between $150,000 and $250,000, plus an additional $60,000 to $100,000 in working capital to cover operating costs during the months before you reach consistent profitability. So the obvious question is, why would anyone do this? The answer comes down to one thing that almost nobody explains correctly when they talk about the coffee business. The gross margin on the actual product is extraordinary. A specialty latte that sells for $5 costs roughly 70 to 90 cents to make in raw ingredients. The coffee, the milk, the syrup, the cup, the lid, that is a gross margin of 80 to 85% on the drink itself. A drip coffee that sells for $3.50 costs about 30 to 40 cents to produce, pushing the gross margin above 90%. For context, the grocery industry operates on gross margins of around 25 to 30%. A software company would celebrate an 80% gross margin. A cafe achieves it on every single drink that comes off the espresso machine, multiple times every hour. Every single day the business is open. But here is the thing nobody tells you when they lead with that number. The gross margin on a latte is not your take-home. It is the starting point of a compression that, by the time it reaches your bank account, has been reduced from 85% to somewhere between 2.5 and 15% of total revenue. The distance between those two numbers is your entire life as a cafe owner. The single largest expense eating into that extraordinary product margin is labor, and it does not move no matter how good your coffee is. Industry benchmarks place labor at 28 to 35% of total revenue for a well-run independent specialty cafe. In 2026, with 19 U.S. states having raised their minimum wage at the start of the year, that number is under pressure in almost every market. Above 38%, the margin disappears entirely, and the business starts losing money even when it is full of customers. Below 25%, service quality usually suffers enough that customer retention falls. It is one of the tightest operational tolerances in any consumer business, and it applies every single week, regardless of whether that week was good or slow. Rent is the second structural cost that does not bend. Industry benchmarks put the rent ceiling at 10 to 14% of total revenue. Above 14%, the numbers almost never work, regardless of how good the coffee is or how loyal the customers are. This is why location is simultaneously the most important decision in opening a cafe and the most dangerous one. The space that looks perfect from the street, the corner unit with the beautiful light, the foot traffic that looks promising on a Wednesday afternoon, is also often the space with rent that sits at 18 or 20% of what your projected revenue can realistically support. And unlike the espresso machine, which you can upgrade later, or the menu, which you can refine, the rent is locked in the day you sign the lease. Most leases run 5 years. If you sign at the wrong number, you spend 5 years trying to grow your way out of a structural problem that the original math already told you would not work. Cost of goods. Coffee beans, milk, syrups, food items, cups, packaging runs at another 25 to 35% of revenue, depending on how much food you serve alongside the coffee. Utilities, insurance, software, equipment maintenance, and marketing consume the remainder. The resulting net profit margin for a mature, well-run, independent specialty cafe averages between 10 and 15% of revenue, with the industry-wide average sitting closer to 5 to 7% once underperforming operations are included. Here is the part that catches most first-time cafe owners completely off guard. The coffee business generates a disproportionate share of its daily revenue in a window of roughly 4 hours in the morning. Peak traffic at most cafes falls between 7 and noon, with the period between 10 and 12 generating 30 to 40% of total daily sales. What that means in practice is that you are staffing and equipping and leasing a space for the full day, but the revenue that justifies all of it arrives in a concentrated burst that is over before lunch. The hours between 2 and 5 in the afternoon at most independent cafes are a slow, quiet test of whether your fixed costs are low enough to survive the dead period between the morning rush and the occasional afternoon customer who wants a cold brew and somewhere to sit with a laptop. The cafes that figure out how to generate meaningful afternoon revenue through a food program, a rotating alcohol license for evenings, a retail shelf of beans and merchandise, or a community event space consistently outperform the ones that rely entirely on the morning window. Between 50 and 74% of independent coffee shops fail within their first 5 years. That is not a statistic designed to scare you out of anything. It is an honest description of a business where fixed costs are high, margins are thin, hours are long, and the most common cause of failure is not bad coffee. A survey of 232 independent coffee shop owners found that 55% cited being unprepared for the full operational complexity of ownership as the primary reason cafes fail. 40% cited a lack of unique brand or customer experience as the second reason. Bad coffee was almost never why a shop closed. The reason shops close is that the rent was 18% of revenue instead of 12%. Or the build-out consumed the working capital reserve, and there was nothing left to survive the slow months of year one. Or the owner underestimated how much it costs to staff a 6 a.m. to 5 p.m. operation 6 days a week, or all three at the same time. And here is where the psychology of cafe ownership becomes its own kind of trap. The people most drawn to opening a cafe are often the ones least equipped to run one profitably. Not because they lack intelligence or work ethic, but because the thing that made them want a cafe in the first place was the feeling of it. The warmth, the community, the idea of creating a space that matters to people. Those are real and valuable things, but they are not the things that determine whether a cafe survives year two. The thing that determines that is whether the rent is under 12% of revenue, whether labor stays under 33%, and whether there was enough working capital in the bank to absorb 6 slow months without making desperate decisions that damaged the customer experience at exactly the moment it needed to be strongest. Most new cafes take 6 to 18 months to reach consistent profitability. During that ramp-up period, the rent, the payroll, the utilities, and the supplier invoices all arrive on schedule, whether the morning rush has found you yet or not. Let's run the numbers on two realistic versions of your cafe. Option 1, a small neighborhood cafe. You spend $150,000 on build-out and equipment, put another $60,000 in working capital reserve, and open in a mid-size American city with rent at $3,000 per month. By year two, you are doing a morning rush that generates around $700 to $900 per day on average, translating to roughly $250,000 to $320,000 in annual revenue. At a 10% net margin, that is $25,000 to $32,000 in annual net profit. At 15% for a well-optimized operation, it is $37,500 to $48,000. That is before you account for an owner's salary, which at most small operations either does not exist in year one or comes directly out of those profit figures. Most small independent cafes never grow much beyond that number. The path forward is not squeezing more out of the same location. It is expanding into food and evening revenue, opening a second location once the first is stable and systematized, or building the brand and selling it to a buyer who wants a proven operation with an established customer base. Option 2, a larger flagship cafe with a proper food program. You spend $300,000 to $400,000 on build-out and equipment. Take a premium 1,500 square foot space in a high-traffic urban location and build a full menu around specialty coffee and fresh food. By year 3, a well-run operation in this format can generate $600,000 to $900,000 in annual revenue. At industry average margins of 10 to 15%, that produces annual net profit of $60,000 to $135,000. The best performing independent flagship cafes in major markets, the ones with strong afternoon food revenue and a loyal daily customer base built over several years, can reach $800,000 to $1.2 million in annual revenue, with net margins pushing toward 15 to 20% in their most mature years. That is a very good business. It is also a very hard one, running on the tightest operational tolerances of almost any consumer-facing industry. Where the difference between a profitable year and a difficult one is often a lease rate that was 3% too high, a labor percentage that crept 4 points above target during a slow season, or an espresso machine that needed $8,000 in repairs in month 11 when the working capital reserve was already thin. The cafes that make it are not the ones with the most beautiful Instagram feed or the most interesting single-origin pour-over menu, though those things matter.
They are the ones run by people who understood the numbers before they signed the lease. Who kept their rent under 12% of revenue? Who maintained their labor under 33%? Who built a working capital buffer that could absorb 6 slow months without cutting staff? And who found a way to generate meaningful revenue in the hours after the morning rush was over? The dream of owning a cafe is not wrong. The warmth, the community, the daily rhythm of it, those are real. The problem is that the dream skips the part where you have to be a ruthlessly competent operator first and a coffee lover second. The ones who figure that out before they sign the lease are the ones still open 5 years later. The ones who figure it out after are the ones who gave someone else a discounted build-out to take over. Not bad for an industry that gets to charge $5 for a drink that costs 85 cents to make.